Hello. This is another lecture series for Black Theology, Black Church, Theology 333. I am Dr. Gregory Jones, and I'm going to be bringing you session 23, the urban church. The urban church. We're going to look at the urban church today. I want you to read chapters 9 and 10 in the Gayrod Wilmore text, Black Religion, Black Radicalism, with information concerning the evolution of the African American experience and understanding the movement toward urban ministry in the African American church, which we'll be talking about today. Understanding the urban church environment is what we'll be taking a look at today, and this will be a supplement to the readings that we have in the course, and I'm hoping that you will take a serious look at comparing what is being said in the chapters with what is going on in the urban church today. We need to examine the evolution of the urban ministry experience. One of the things that we need to do is look at the progression of the development of urban ministry. If you remember the past, we talked about the past migration of African Americans into northern cities provided the population that we see in urban situations and inner city situations that we see today. We talked about the migration and how the migration moved African Americans from the southern states into some of the northern cities. And just to give you an example, when we talk about Detroit or Chicago or New York or St. Louis or East St. Louis, we talk about Cleveland, any of the northern and what we call Great Lakes cities, the constellation of cities, we see a vast migration of African American blacks coming from the south into the northern kind of communities, inner city communities. They come for a variety of reasons, but primarily they're looking for jobs, housing, education, but they're also dealing with the issue of Jim Crow laws in the South. They're dealing with lynching in the South, black codes in the South, and the fact that the discriminatory practices in the South continue to exacerbate blacks' aspirations to become full citizens in the United States. We see this migration happening a couple of times, but we see the civil rights movement providing some relief to some of the concerns that we see in the southern states and in the northern communities as well, to some of the pressures of the inner city, but they do not remove poverty, and they do not remove, the civil rights movement did not remove poverty, nor did it remove discrimination or the lack of education and unemployment in the inner city areas. When we talk about the civil rights movement, of course, we're talking about Dr. King, Malcolm X, Patrice Lumumba, and others who fought all around the globe for justice for African Americans, and we know that some of the concentrations of some of the impoverished community we see in the inner cities today come from the legacy of traditions that we see evolving out of the civil rights movement and that black migration that we just talked about. The African American church plays a critical role in addressing these and ongoing conditions in the urban community. And what we're going to talk about today is some of those ongoing conditions and the central character of the African American urban church ministry. The centered characteristics of the African American urban church ministry involves basically three major areas. The first area, the addressing of retention of values and value orientation. The African American church essentially plays a major role at this particular time. We're talking about from, say, maybe the 1920s into present day. We see an evolution and then a de-evolution of the urban church ministry. But I'm basically concentrating on contemporary urban ministry now. We see the African American church playing a centralized part in retaining values for African Americans in the African American community in the inner city. The African American church traditionally provided the means by which blacks understood how to relate to one another and to relate to the world in terms of values. The African American church also provided the provision of practical needs of the urban poor. And what we're talking about there is entrepreneur leadership. We're talking about the development of housing, affordable housing for African Americans, jobs, education, political education and advocacy. And political education is very important because as the blacks migrate to the north, they don't realize how important political education is in terms of local government, and so they get manipulated a lot. But the African American church provides a means of leadership to begin to educate African Americans on how to deal with the local political environment that they find themselves in. Economic development, housing, the creation of job training programs are all a part of the urban ministry canopy, if you will, in the inner city. And then thirdly, the African American church, urban church character shows spiritual and communal kinds of retention and tradition. The African American church allows the African Americans who are coming from the South to the North to retain and enhance their spiritual and communal traditions in terms of ritualistic symbolism in the African American worship experience. Worship study, the evolution and development of leadership, religious leadership in particular, based kinds of instruction that allowed African Americans to evolve into the leadership that we see today. When we talk about Al Sharpton, you're talking about Jesse Jackson, wherever you're talking about Reverend Martin Luther King, all of those individuals influenced and have been influenced by the ministry of the African American urban church. Moving on, we look at some of the challenges that we see this church, this urban ministry is taking place. And the challenges and threats to the urban church ministry environment. We see an erosion of the leadership base, middle class assimilation into American culture, American society. There are more African Americans now trying to aspire to middle classness, and we see a class issue becoming very much a part of the inner city ministries of the African American church. Many African American churches are losing leaderships to suburban churches simply because the inner city is not looked upon in a favorable light to middle class African American aspiration. We see crime being taken on as an alternative, a viable alternative to community building, and we see a lack of support and resources for inner city ministries. African American pastors are constantly trying to find resources to deal with the ministries that they're trying to present to the African American community. We see the multicultural inclusion and diversity absorption of African American churches into Western European culture. In other words, this whole notion of inclusiveness and diversity is a code word to dissolve the concentrations of African American cultural leadership and tradition in the urban ministry setting. And this is a very, very serious issue, because what we see as blacks, African Americans, aspire to be more like Western Europeans in terms of their middle class aspiration, and they label it to be an inclusive and diverse kind of process. The masses of African Americans who are in the urban area are left alone and kind of deserted in terms of the African American leadership community. And we see some resurgence of people who are being concerned about the masses of African Americans in the inner city. But increasingly it's becoming a class-conscious kind of perspective. Look at the local magazines. If you look at some of the local magazines and resources and social media that reflect the aspiration of African Americans, it is not dealing with the reality of the inner city African American poor. And then the loss of the spiritual center within the generations of the African American under the stress of white supremacy. What I mean there is I'm talking about the spiritual center of African Americans with the African American church. By the African American church losing the leadership, there's a whole generation of African Americans who do not see the African American church any longer as the spiritual center and development of their values. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, there was a connection between the development of your spirituality and the aspiration of all African American people. It's not so today. People are very individualistic in terms of their pursuit of spiritual center, and the church no longer plays a centralized role as it used to in terms of establishing values and establishing spiritual and religious center for the African American community. My own personal relationship is seated with the kinds of experience I had at South Shore Community Church, where it was an inner city church, and we served about 1,000 people a month with food, and we had other kinds of programs that we would do for the African American community. And this was a church that was committed to, when I served there, and that was several years ago, 20 or so years ago, dealing with the issue of the loss of jobs. There were African American brothers and sisters who had lost jobs because of the Southworks Steel and Republic Steel Works were deindustrializing and buying cheaper steel in the international community. And so there was a plethora of brothers and sisters who needed support by the inner city church community, and the churches responded to those kinds of concerns. No more today do we see those kinds of efforts being taken by the inner city church. They are literally struggling to survive. And when we talk about mega churches, and we will talk about mega churches in the future, we'll see that the mega church has a different attitude, except for an exceptional few, as regards to the development of the African American community. Oftentimes, the megachurch is connected to the whole notion of prosperity, and thus connected to the whole class aspiration that is part and parcel of Western European economic and social ideological construct. And we need to take a hard look at that, because blacks, African Americans, Bluppies, however you want to call them, are starting to embrace that in a very, very powerful way. One of the things that I learned in terms of working in food justice programs and doing urban ministries is oftentimes we're not looking at the essential needs that we see in the urban community. And so I celebrate the fact that the African American Church has given leadership in terms of health care and food justice and affordable housing, and dealing with the issue of police brutality and the whole notion of organizing the African American community in a way that would be positive to deal with the urban experience. What I would suggest to you as we look at the urban ministry kind of phenomena, as we look more closely to it, please pay attention to the fact that the African American church has historically been the foundational institution to develop these communities. And when we see the dismantling and the decline of the African American church in the inner city, or the struggling of the African American church in the inner city, we are also looking at the struggling and the decline of the African American community in the inner city. Today, when we go into the inner cities, we see a population of individuals who are struggling mightily to deal with the issues that they confront on a day-to-day basis in terms of economics, in terms of social injustice. And I would encourage you to, as we begin our study on the future of the African American church, I believe that the urban church that takes a stand on checking and dealing with the issue of AIDS and HIV, the urban church that deals with the issue of crime and drugs that are being brought into the community, the urban church that deals with the issue of affordable housing, the urban church that raises the issue of health care, and the urban church that talks about quality of life, is the basis by which we begin to repair and restore the African American community. So next time that we meet together, we will get involved in looking at the mega churches and how the mega churches have influence in and have changed the outlook of the future of the African American church. Until that time, I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.